Welcome to Highland Waves, a podcast coming to you from Marshbrook Studios, located beside the world-famous Margaree River in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, Canada. At Highland Waves, we feature stories about the people, places, and the visitors who come to Inverness County. I'm Pat Wall, your host. This morning, I'm pleased to have with me Dr. Del Muise, also known to family and friends as Del. Welcome to Highland Waves, Del.
Thanks very much, Pat. I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, thank you. Del is a historian and Professor Emeritus of Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Prior to becoming a professor, he worked at the National Museum of Man, originally called the Canadian Museum of Civilization, also in Ottawa. He's now retired, but remains active in the history field and especially with the Nova Scotia Museum system. For you, Del, where did it all begin?
Well, I guess it all began when I learned how to read. I had two older sisters who were school teachers, and they managed to get a Book of Knowledge set, which is sort of a knockoff of Britannica's. And I started devouring that when I was about 5 or 6 years old and never quite stopped.
From high school, you went to St. X?
Yeah, there was almost no Canadian history taught in high school. History was my favorite subject, and I did fairly well in it, but it's only in grade 12 that we got even a slight little inkling that Canada existed from a historical perspective. So really, when I went to Xavier College in Sydney, having finished grade 12 in New Waterford, that I encountered Sister Margaret Beaton, who was in the process of starting to invent what would eventually become the Beaton Institute, at that time known as the Cape Bretoniana Collection.
Wow.
Soon as she found out I was interested in history, she started feeding stuff to me, which was really quite interesting.
That's great. Were your parents academics?
Oh no, my father was from here in East Margaree, and he left school, I think, probably at about 12 or 13. Went working in the woods and eventually ended up working as a coal miner in New Waterford.
Your connection to Margaree in Inverness County, what is it?
Well, my dad was born here in East Margaree, just a few hundred yards from where we're sitting at the moment, and my mom was from Shettycamp. Having said that, it wasn't until I was about 30 years old that I spent any time in Margaree, or Shettycamp for that matter. We were relatively poor, as miners go, and a big family, no car, no easy access to coming over to Margaree. So it was only at a transition stage in my life after I'd left teaching at Dalhousie that I came to live here for a month and a half before going up to Ottawa to work at the National Museum.
Recently, in the local newspaper called the Oran, you wrote about blacksmithing in the Margaree area, and just recently you made an interesting find. Can we talk about that?
Oh, that's one of the really exciting finds, I think, in terms of documents relating to East Margaree particularly. I had written a piece in the Iran, really working away from some photographs that had been taken by George Thomas back in the early 1970s of some blacksmiths in the Margaree Valley. And when I posted that on Facebook, we took the opportunity to ask anybody who might be interested and who might have material relating to blacksmithing to get in touch. And almost immediately thereafter, Hubert Chesson from down in Belcote got in touch and sort of told me about the ledger that he had, which had been passed down to him from his uncle, William Chesson, who had a shop here in East Margaree. And William came from the Forks originally, where his father had been a blacksmith. What's interesting about the find really is that it's one of the very few existing continuous ledgers of a blacksmith for anywhere in Canada, as far as I know, and I've looked around a little bit. Essentially, what happens is that William comes and sets up in East Margaree, roughly in 1925-6. It starts on a small scale, and then he continues until about 1954-5. But in the middle of that period, he's servicing all of the farms and most of the people in and around East Margaree, and sometimes as far as Margaree Forks and even Margaree Harbor. And the detail in there is on a daily basis. He's telling us about the kinds of things that are happening within the community.
It's a pretty interesting find. What will happen to the document?
Well, Hubert had loaned it to me, and I had then brought it up to the Beaton Institute, which I referred to earlier. And the archivist there was completely entranced by it. I had nothing that compares to it. So what we've done is we've digitized it, and it might eventually become available on the website of the Beaton Institute. The original document, with some reluctance, because I was enjoying so much looking at it, I had to give back to Hubert, which I did just a few days ago.
Well, it's great that you have it in a digital form and it's available in that sense.
Well, yes, and Hubert has also agreed that at some point in the future, if he finds an appropriate place, he'd like to deposit it somewhere in Inverness County, and particularly in Margaree, if he could figure out somebody who would look after it in the long term.
Okay. Sort of shifting a little bit to the recent present, you've also been president of the Margaree Lake Ainslie Heritage River Association, and in fact done a lot, especially in the last 5 years, to keep it in the public eye. And the communities along the system are grateful for that. What do you see in the future for that organization?
Well, I mean, what we did was to take advantage of an opportunity that came by in the Canada 150 sort of project, which came out of the federal government and provided a little bit of money. What was important about that seed money was that it gave us the opportunity to start thinking about how we would memorialize the river and also do a little bit of historical interpretation about the history of the Heritage River, but also the history of the river itself. So we did a number of projects. Perhaps the most important one was the immediate one that we did was a series of pull-up banners which explored various aspects of the history of the river. And then we did a series of signs that we posted at various places along the river using historical photographs to offset the current interpretation. So I think that process is about done now in terms of what we can do. This year we refreshed all those signs, giving them a kind of a different kind of feel, but the information still stays much the same. What I think has to happen is we have to figure out a way to get the Heritage River Association a little more integrated with other heritage organizations and or museums in the area. And we're pursuing that in terms of a discussion that's going on with merging the Heritage River Society in some fashion at least with the Margaree Salmon Museum, which has a limited sort of capacity to deal with all the things that we might like to do. But if you were at the museum, I think we would have the opportunity to do a little bit more research and research-based work, dealing with the history of not so much the river as the communities on the river.
How can the public become involved in this?
Well, it's a kind of a tricky thing. I mean, one of the ways in which we involve the public at the moment is through social media. And you get a very strong response to that. I mean, Simon LeBlanc's old photographs of Margaree, for instance, is an extraordinarily popular site, and probably has done more to enliven an interest in the history of Margaree, or at least the lower part of the Margaree, than anything else that's happened in the last while. And I think we should do more of that. The museum has a website, and has a presence in social media. Integrating the Heritage River with that, I think, would give an opportunity to sort of develop that in a number of different ways.
Well, certainly the signs have been a big hit because I've talked to a lot of people who like them, and they're very informative, and the visuals also connect with the past as well, so which is very good.
Yeah.
As I mentioned in the introduction, earlier in your career, you worked at the National Museum of Man in Ottawa. What did you do there?
Well, I had been teaching at Carleton teaching at Dalhousie University for a couple of years before that. And I had always had an interest in trying to reach bigger audiences than you can in the academic community. I mean, teaching in university is a variety of different kinds of opportunities that you get to reach a number of students, etc. But the academic life, in terms of its scholarly production, is kind of incestuous, and there are sort of problems involved with that. Anyway, when I went to the museum, I got an opportunity to sort of start thinking about what I had been primarily interested in, which was how do you get history to a broader public? Okay, and in the museum, and that was a really a fertile time in Canadian museum life. After the centennial of 1967, there was a great outreach and a huge expansion of museums. So we were involved in doing exhibits within the museum. The main one that I was involved with was what they called A Few Acres of Snow, which was an interpretive site that looked at the whole history of Canada. My immediate role was as the Atlantic Provinces historian, but very soon after that I became research director within what they call the History Division, which is a division within the museum. And the project that I'm probably most identified with is something called Canada's Visual History. Canada's Visual History was a series of 100 sets of slides, 30 slides in each set, with a bilingual introduction by young academics from around the country, basically with the objective of trying to bring social history, the new kind of social history that was being done, to classrooms around the country. And in the end, we probably sold about 1 million slides.
Wow.
And it had a big reach, but the technology had a lifespan. Okay, and it basically ran out after about a decade and a half. But it was really, really a wonderful thing to be involved with, and that was one. The other thing that I did mostly at the museum was to begin to develop my interest in the history of coal mining. From an academic or scholarly perspective. So I was doing an awful lot of research, both in Ottawa and here in Nova Scotia.
After the museum, you went to Carleton University.
That's right. I had done my master's degree at Carleton after I had finished at St. FX. So I had a kind of continuing connection there. Some of the professors that I had studied with were still around. And while I was at the museum from 1969 until from 1969 until about 1978, I had always been an adjunct professor at Carleton. So I was teaching one course in the evenings mostly on the history of the Atlantic Provinces. I woke up one day and they had an opportunity for me to sort of walk in a different direction. So I accepted a position at Carleton in 1978, and very soon afterwards began to develop both my interest in the Atlantic Provinces as well as my experience at the museum in the area of public history. Okay, so what we did over the next decade or so was to develop a program that was basically designed to take postgraduate students at the master's level and give them some introduction to what history could be like outside of the university, working in museums, in archives, historic sites, and heritage organizations. By the end of the first few years that I was at Carleton, we had a fully operational master's program, which I was directing and continue to direct until I retired.
During the course of your career as a professor, you've co-authored, edited, and contributed several chapters to several books. And one of the books you edited was The Atlantic Provinces in Confederation. Could you comment on that and how the Atlantic Provinces became part of Confederation? Sort of a little bit of history there.
Well, it has all kinds of elements to it. I'd almost forgotten about that. I mean, what happened in the late 1970s, really, I guess, and the early 80s, is that there was a tremendous push to try and get regional history on the agenda of historical departments, etc., in universities. And my closest friend and colleague, a fellow named Ernie Forbes, who had some time in Cape Breton but really considered himself a mainlander, he and I were commissioned to do a book and write it on our own, as a double-authored kind of, well, like a textbook, but not quite. Try to encapsulate the previous 2 decades of historiography and the writing about the history of the region. And eventually we decided that it'd be a better idea to get the people who had been writing that history to write the new book. So we gathered together what we thought were the best group of young historians who had been writing about the region, and we were young then too, so that was okay. And they all responded very, very wonderfully, and that resulted in that book, which had an enormous success across the region. And within that context, I wrote a couple of chapters, the introductory chapter, plus the chapter on Canada's entry into, or Nova Scotia's and the Maritimes' entry into Confederation, which had been my PhD thesis, done way back in the 1960s. So I'd been working on that, so it worked out very well.
What were the drivers for the Atlantic provinces to join Confederation? A brief summary.
Well, first of all, I think we have to talk about it in terms of the Maritimes first, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, because Newfoundland stayed out of the game. And even though there were a couple of attempts to bring Newfoundland in the 1880s and in the 1890s, there was a certain amount of reluctance. So the driving sort of engine for the development of an interest in Confederation or joining with the other British North American colonies was essentially the building of railroads and the development of some kind of interest in an alternative economic development that went beyond sort of fish farm and forests that were a part of the system up to that point. So in Nova Scotia, you had basically a division between the parts of the province that were oriented towards fishing and the parts of the province that were gradually becoming integrated into a national or not a national at that point, but a railway building, sort of process that created debt, and the debt required servicing. And the bottom line also was that the British no longer wanted to have anything much to do with managing these provinces on an ongoing basis. So essentially what they created was a new empire, which was Canada.
One of your papers is titled Coal Mining in Canada, a Historical and Comparative Overview. Perhaps you can tell us the importance of coal mining here in Nova Scotia, and especially in Cape Breton.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I would have spoken about, I suppose, in the context of the entry into Confederation, was a certain amount of pressure was coming from the coal producers in the province, who were mostly Americans at this point, although we are gradually getting some Central Canadian interest in it. But really what happened in the 1850s and in the period just prior to Confederation was a kind of loosening up of the restrictions that had been placed on the development of the coal mining industry by the British government, which had given a monopoly over all of the coal mining in the province to a London-based firm that late became known really as the General Mining Association, and it had a monopoly over all minerals and all mineral development. The Nova Scotia government had fought against that and succeeded just prior to Confederation in opening up the possibility of more development. So you're going really from a fairly small industry, which was basically pulling coal out of the ground and shipping it to the United States. I mean, not unlike what we have with oil today. And it's replaced by a process that tries to sort of use more of the coal within a Canadian kind of context. Draws in a lot more investment, but really the takeoff comes after Confederation, really in the period from the 1870s through the turn of the century, where the production or output of coal goes from 500,000 tons a year to 8 million tons a year, over a few decades, and becomes integrated with a massive steel industry, which is established in Sydney and in Sydney mines, and to some extent in New Glasgow as well. So the manufacturing sort of thrust of that early development, or later middle development, I suppose we could call it, of the coal mining industry, really in the 1860s and 70s, is a big push towards Confederation. A guy like Charles Tupper, for instance, who becomes an important sort of member of the new government in Ottawa, is a guy who's pushing the coal mining industry. Now, he's from Cumberland County, but it's the Spring Hill coal minings that he's involved in.
Certainly had a tremendous economic and cultural impact on Nova Scotia.
Absolutely. I mean, it has a very dramatic impact on my own family. I mean, my mom and dad were both part of that huge migration of people from rural Cape Breton that is pulled into the Sydney vortex, really. In their case, they went to New Waterford, where approximately a third of the population was Acadian from the Inverness area by the 1920s, which is when my dad goes over. And he spent his entire career there. So there's, the coal mining industry has a big impact on the way in which the communities shape themselves, because they draw resources and they draw people, of course. And essentially coal mining consumes bodies and their energy and their work, and it becomes, of course, a class-based society in a whole lot of different ways, which really informed my own early thinking about history.
Certainly, it also impacted immigration to here.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that I've really been looking at very closely just in the last little while is the 1931 census of Canada, which is a manuscript census. So you get a list of every person who exists in the country at that point. And if you look at East Margaree, for instance, you could simply, apart from the names, you could put dittos beside everything. I mean, they're all born here. They all have the same kind of background in terms of their Acadian upbringing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas if you go to a town like New Waterford, I found my mom and dad, who had been married 2 years before the 1931 census. And there they sit, and on one side of them is an Italian family. On the other side of them is a Polish family. Across the street is a Ukrainian family, and whole neighborhoods of New Waterford are dominated by these Middle European migrants who are coming to look for work, and they become an integral part, really, of that community.
Another book you co-authored with 5 others is Canadians and Their Past. Can you briefly talk about that book?
Wow, that's a big project. I mean, it was done over a 5-year period, and really was an attempt to do for Canada what had been done by some historians and others in the United States and in Australia and in Great Britain. And essentially, the bottom question that we were asking was, how is the presence of the past, either defined as heritage or as history, which has a kind of there's a kind of denominational difference between heritage and history. But essentially what it wanted to do was to ask, after 50 years of development of Canadian history as a kind of central element of the way in which we think about the past of the country, how do everyday people sort of see themselves within that kind of context? So the core of it was to develop a national survey The national survey, was designed, with the help of a number of people who do that kind of survey work, basically, at York University. And the survey had approximately 100 questions. And we were inviting people to sort of engage in a discussion about how they think about the past and what they've done, what they trust, who they trust, what they've done in the last little while, whether they visited museums or whether they see museums as interesting places. And, the other thing that we were looking for is what sorts of history do you sort of think are most central to you and your lives? And what we found, really matching to some extent but with a lot of different sort of orientations, was something quite similar to what they found in the other countries. That is, people think that big history is okay, but what's really important to them is the history of their families and their communities. And often the definition of family and community is intermixed. I mean, families and communities, particularly in smaller areas, or rural areas, family and community might mean the same thing almost, with the kind of integration that you get. The other thing that was there that I thought was really interesting, because I was very fascinated amongst the five of us who were working on it. I was the one who was more interested in museums, and one of the questions that's central to what we were talking about was the question of trust. Who do you trust? Remembering that this was done before social media had become broadly available, so no one trusted the web in any way, shape, or form. They didn't really trust teachers and or professors all that much, although, there was a kind of marginal difference. But who they really trusted were museums and public institutions. And they saw them as having an authoritative place within their community. And I'd argue that was a huge change from what you would have seen back in the 1960s, that 50-year period with the development of museums. And the interesting thing about that is, when I was growing up in Cape Breton in the 1950s, there was no museum anywhere. They didn't really exist, but now, or when we did the survey, there were probably 50 or 60 of them in Cape Breton. So an enormous change, and people see the museums as being a part of their lives. At least they can.
Yeah, one of the things that always intrigues me is the trust that people put in that. But how do we verify what is true or false with history?
That's kind of a big question. The short answer to it is research, and the other answer to it, I think, is a word that's bandied about and is quite central to a lot of the more recent sort of developments in history, and that is the word critical. So critical history that is critically looking at documents and the record of the past and sort of finding in them some kind of meaning. And what that means is that there can be a debate about what the nature of the documents are. Now, up until the 1950s and 60s, most of the history was political, unless it was sort of local. So that political sort of development was basically an argument about biography of prime ministers, etc., which was not terribly interesting once you get into it. But when you get into the question of who do you trust and how do you trust it, we ask people, why do you trust museums? And they say they trust museums because they have the stuff. They have the artifacts, they have the documents. They don't differentiate between museums and archives that much. So they have the real thing in museums, and they do research. And then we asked a little bit further because we pushed them on these questions. Those interviews, by the way, that we did for that project lasted up to half an hour on the telephone. So it was very, very intense. But when we pushed them and asked them about why they trusted museums so much, essentially they said if they didn't get it right, someone would tell them. And if someone told them, then they would change it.
What role is the internet now playing in history?
Well, you're talking about a guy who, in myself anyway, who was always a very early adopter or adapter, I guess, of new technologies, and we've done an awful lot of work with the internet. I mean, the internet. You have to make a distinction between the internet and social media. I mean, the big thing with the internet is basically that what you've done is you've allowed everyday people who have access to the internet to have access to documents that they would never have had before. I mean, the digitization of the National Archives, I mean, it's a huge project that's ongoing, and every archive in the country is doing the same kind of thing. So your access to documents is way, way beyond what it might have ever been. The other hand, with social media and sort of broad access to that kind of documentary sort of record, what you get are people who play their own games with how they will try to interpret the documents. But on the other hand, social media, you know, if you look at it in the case of what we're doing here in Margaree with the old photographs of Margaree, it's quite stunning the way in which it can reach people and also engage them. Because every photograph that's put up on that site and all of the articles from the Inverness Oran that we're reproducing for that site provokes reactions from upwards of a dozen or 20 or 50 people in some cases who you know sort of see their own history being portrayed to them and have an easy way of responding to it.
Do you see the study of history increasing in universities and schools?
Well, yes and no. I mean, what's happened is the formal study of history, you know, in terms of a discipline, that there's a kind of disengagement with that in universities now, and what you're seeing enormously, I think, is a falling off of the level of enrollment in history programs. But on the other hand, what you have is a dramatic growth in terms of the number of people who are doing alternative kinds of history to the sort we were doing in the past. So gender-based history and you know, a whole lot of other kinds of things. But that public history movement that we started at Carleton in the 1980s and early 1990s, virtually every university in the country now has some kind of a program in public history.
Well, that's wonderful.
So it's trying to train students to sort of go outside of the university.
It certainly seems to me, from the people I talk to, there is a lot of interest in genealogy, which of course will add to history as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and genealogy is often the conduit that you take to get into history. And whenever you talk to people who are doing genealogy, and one of the things that I did a kind of a project with genealogy after the Canadians and their pasts, where we did a similar kind of survey of genealogists, and over and over and over again, I mean, what people were talking about in genealogy is the double-pronged sort of objective. I mean, one is to get it straight in terms of the lineage of people. But the second part of it, and the more important part for most genealogists, are the stories. Okay, genealogy carries stories forward within communities. So community history, or community-based history at a local level is almost always, you know, genealogically driven.
That's interesting. As a professor, I have to ask you what advice you would give to a young student in grade 12 that would help them to determine what course they should take in a career path. What do they need to think about as they think about their future?
It's kind of a tricky question, and the response would have to vary depending on the student that you were talking with.
But in general,
I would say read. I mean, the important thing to do is to learn how to read and read critically. And the second thing is to find something that makes you happy. And if you find something that makes you happy, then you never have to work for a day in your life. And there are all sorts of opportunities, sort of there. When I came out of high school, there were three alternatives, maybe four. One, you could go and join the Army. If you were a working class kid. My older brother did that. He joined the Air Force, actually. You could become a teacher. And teaching was a burgeoning kind of activity during that particular time period. Or you could go to Toronto and work in a factory. All of those options were there before me in 1958 and 59. The other one was that you could sort of continue your education and direct it. And the biggest piece of advice that I would give to people when they enter into sort of university, I said, don't be afraid to change. Don't be afraid to react to what you're hearing and what interests you, because it'll change over time.
Of course.
And don't be afraid to take a year away from it and then come back to it, because it's a lifelong process.
Well, we're getting close on time. Is there anything else you would like to add before we shut her down?
Well, nothing too much, except to say that I think that this podcast is a wonderful opportunity for people to get a little better acquainted with each other within the community, and also with the hope that it'll continue.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us this morning about your background and your historical knowledge, and of course your advice. I wish you well in your future endeavors. And thank you to our listeners. Please don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you can stay up to date. And our thought for today is by Norman Cousins, who's an American journalist who said, "History is a vast early warning system." So long for now, Pat.